We'll call the meeting back to order, and Dr. Ridgway, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, good morning, or good afternoon rather. Thank you for inviting me here to testify today. My name is Robin Mills Ridgway. I'm Director of Environmental Health and Safety Regulatory Compliance with Physical Facilities at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. I hold a PhD in environmental engineering from Purdue, and I am a licensed professional engineer in Indiana. I serve as a resource for environmental regulatory compliance at Purdue, and in particular, I analyze the impacts of current and upcoming regulations on Purdue operations and proposed projects. I also participate in rulemaking activities at the state and federal level to assist the university with planning. Purdue University in West Lafayette is like a small city with 47,000 students and an expansive research infrastructure. The university has many support and research activities that are covered by EPA regulations. Just a quick list of some of the peripheral areas that I also oversee. We have a 1,600-acre multi-species confined animal feed operation, which is covered by EPA regulations. We have a federally permitted hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility that handles 188,000 pounds of hazardous waste annually. We have a campus stormwater permit that covers runoff from campus, as well as we own and operate a public water supply on campus. One of the other facilities on campus that I'm very involved in is our combined heat and power facility. It is a 41 megawatt combined heat and power facility that's primarily coal-fired. And it supplies nearly all of the campus heating, steam, chilled water, and on average, 60% of the campus's electricity needs. This highly efficient facility holds a point source MPDS permit, and we also have many Clean Air Act regulations that apply to us. And I'll just list these off. The New Source Performance Standards, the Boiler MACT, both of them, the one that came and then was vacated and then came again. The RICE MACT that covers emergency generators, greenhouse gas reporting, greenhouse gas permitting as part of the PSD program, and Purdue's utility plant boilers are also regulated as non-electric utility generating units, non-EGUs, under the NOx budget trading program, which is now the vacated CARE, which will soon be the transport program. So sort of evolved. EPA has also just recently proposed the coal ash regulation, and although they say quite clearly in the regulation that it is targeted at electric utilities, I think we all know that industrial facilities will also be pulled under this regulation as the states move to implement the program. I don't believe that they will differentiate from source. A core part of my position is monitoring regulatory developments and apprising the university administration of impacts, or more often, projected impacts for planning purposes. Because of our long planning timelines, I'm frequently asked to look out 5 and sometimes 10 years. I try to predict with as much certainty as possible to make sure the administration understands the full spectrum of potential impact. As uncertainty increases, the impact spectrum broadens. The projected impact of layered regulations then becomes a driving factor in decision-making, potentially causing our administration to delay a decision until certainty is reached. We recently canceled a clean coal boiler project that is a good example of this potential outcome. The project followed a multiple-year planning timeline, which is typical of large capital projects at a state university. By the time the project was to be commenced, the regulatory landscape had changed, and the likelihood of future regulations caused the Board of Trustees to actually cancel the project in February of 2011. The piling on of regulations impacts continuance and expansion of highly efficient district energy, whether it be biomass, clean coal, or natural gas, combined heat and power. Protection of the environment and enhancement of energy supply takes a menu of approaches. Each facility and location is different. The planning challenges associated with a rapidly changing regulatory landscape is not unique to a university. However, universities cannot relocate or consolidate operations like a for-profit manufacturer might be able to, nor are we able to pass the cost on to a customer. Our students are our customers, so the added cost of compliance or additional purchased utilities falls back on the taxpayers. We're committed to providing educational foundation for our students as economically as possible, and the key to good fiscal stewardship is careful long-term planning. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this opportunity to testify and would be pleased to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Dr. Ridgway. Ms. Steinzer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Committee to conduct a breathtakingly ambitious analysis of how regulations required by Congress might affect energy prices in the United States in 2030. A crystal ball might well prove more effective in deriving these estimates. For reasons that are left a mystery but seem amazingly misguided, the legislation ignores the benefits that would be achieved by the targeted regulations. Rules to protect public health and the environment most definitely do not have the effect of sweeping money into a pile and setting it on fire. Rather, they save the lives of millions of people, prevent many more millions from getting sick or becoming sicker, and preserve the irreplaceable natural resources without which human life would be impossible. Omitting benefits is akin to assessing our country's well-being by carefully counting its GDP in dollars while ignoring whether Americans have a life expectancy over 50, are well enough to go to work or school, are able to take care of each other, enjoy our leisure, or leave a sustainable world for our future, for our children. The Clean Air Act amendments targeted by Train are uniformly recognized as a wonderful economic bargain by experts from the right to the left of the political spectrum. According to EPA's very conservative numbers, clean air rules saved 164,300 adult lives in 2010 and will save 237,000 lives annually by 2020. Last but not least, the Train Act targets EPA's proposed coal ash rule. My testimony includes a chart showing the coal ash disposal sites in the districts of the members of this subcommittee, and I urge you to take a look at it. Some of you have coal sites that are high hazard. It's very ironic that most of the witnesses on this panel today have been talking so much about uncertainty. The Train Act is founded on uncertainty and unknowability. Most of the calculations must be completed by August 2012, a date preceding by a few weeks the national presidential elections. The studies are so ridden with uncertainty that their numbers would be not just meaningless but deceptive. The only silver lining in this quixotic effort is that it should remind Americans of the hard lesson we learned when Wall Street crashed. Alleging large numbers derived from complex calculations as facts, then wrapping them up in a glossy binder, does not make the numbers or the facts either true or reliable. Imagine for a moment that you could muster a meeting of the most sophisticated and knowledgeable experts on global oil prices. Throw in climate scientists, military experts, geologists, and the leaders of the 10 countries with the largest deposits of oil, natural gas, and coal in the world. Now ask what the wholesale and retail costs of these fuels will be in 2030. You would get laughter, shrugs, and protestations of disbelief that you are serious. Over the last several weeks, we've seen popular uprisings course across the Middle East, sending gas prices through the roof. No one knows how these deeply rooted social cataclysms will play out, and they are likely to play a far more significant role in determining energy prices 10 or 20 years hence than the projected costs of an EPA regulation that has not even been proposed yet. And this legislation would cover rules that have not even been proposed yet. The legislation makes the job of knowing the unknowable impossible, and is likely to result in exceptionally burdensome requirements on the private sector and state and local governments. In fact, I would call it in some ways the great-grandmother of all unfunded mandates. Only private corporations have the information that is needed under this regulation to determine what projects have been organized and are proposed that will be affected by changes in energy prices. And the studies that are required cannot be completed without their help. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Let's do this right. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Scott Siegel, and I'm director of the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council. I'm also a partner at the law firm of Bracewell Giuliani. It's my pleasure to be with you. I believe it is still this afternoon. The power sector, on whose behalf I'm here today, faces a wave of overlapping regulations. Even EPA admits that the Utility MACT, for one example, costs at least $10 billion annually, making it one of the most expensive rules in the history of the agency. Credible analyses have found cost estimates literally an order of magnitude higher. But of interest to this subcommittee, while Utility MACT is quite serious, is that EPA also has or will promulgate a broad series of new rules in the immediate future with compliance deadlines on or before 2015. These rules include greenhouse gas limitations, ash and other residual limitations, national ambient air quality standards for SO2, NOx, SOx, ozone, particulate matter, a new transport rule, cooling water intake rule under 316B, and discharge limiting effluent standards under the Clean Water Act. Most administrations feel like it's a good day at the job when they seek to change one national ambient air quality standard or maybe two over the course of a 4 or 8 year administration. But that's regardless of whether we're talking Democratic or Republican administrations. This administration thinks it's a good day at the job to do 5 simultaneously. So it is very important that we take a look at overlapping impacts. A recent ICF International analysis of pending and promulgated EPA regulations for the power sector, which I've asked to have placed in the record, shows that when a complete environmental future is analyzed, over 150 gigawatts of coal, half of the U.S. coal fleet, are at risk of being unavailable in 2015 for needed energy and required reliability due to insufficient time to install controls or replace generation. The ICF data, when subjected to further economic analysis and controlled for appropriate sensitivities, yields substantial net impacts on job creation in the United States. U.S. employment income is estimated to drop by an amount equivalent to the earnings of 2 million to 2.5 million full-time workers. This estimate includes an estimated increase in offsetting compliance-related employment equivalent to about 200,000 to 1 million full-time jobs in the early years of implementation. Without the offsets, the estimated reduction in worker income would be as high as 3.5 million jobs from the overlapping regulations. As further frame of reference for what these overlapping regulations place at risk, we looked at Penn State's estimate of the total economic footprint of coal-fueled electric generation by 2015. They found that'd be about $1 trillion, $362 billion in annual household incomes, and about 6.8 million jobs. The impact of increased costs on retail and businesses is particularly troubling. Again, referencing the ICF data, particularly in certain regions, retail electricity price is estimated to increase by 20 to 25%. The average U.S. household is estimated to lose buying power of up to $500 per year. Consumer energy cost impacts are likely to be regressive, with 1/4 of Americans already reporting that they have trouble paying for power, and for minority communities and for the elderly, the situation is even worse. Certain sectors of the economy have become increasingly sensitive even to minor changes in the cost of electricity. You heard from a university a moment ago, but the healthcare sector itself also finds that provisions of almost all services are related to energy costs, with hospitals using twice as much electricity per square foot than comparable office space. And this is not a highly hypothetical EPA air model. This is the bills that our healthcare sector actually pays. Some have claimed that the suite of power sector regulations will stimulate new investment in technology of various descriptions, so-called green jobs. However, the data cited above demonstrates these are temporary job gains and still create a deficit of up to 2.5 million jobs. But in any event, it would be foolish in the extreme to believe that heavy regulatory burdens have ever been truly conducive to business confidence, investment, or job creation. Recent experience in Europe demonstrates that for every 4 green jobs created, 9 higher-paying industrial jobs are lost. By 2015, the coal-fueled power plants in the U.S. will have invested as much as $125 billion in advanced emission control technologies, and success to date has been clear. The U.S. electric power sector has reduced its emissions of NOx, of SOx, and a 40% reduction in mercury. However, as in 1998, the agency still can find no direct, additional, or incremental health benefits associated with the reduction of non-mercury HAPs, which is the major cost driver within the utility MAC proposal. What can be done? President Obama himself, in his January executive order, called upon agencies to take into account the cost of cumulative regulations, which is precisely what the TRAIN Act does. It'll be an excellent tool to prevent EPA from hastily adopting guidelines and regulations without careful consideration of their actual benefits and economic impacts. If it is true that these rules are such a great bargain, then nobody on this panel should have anything to fear from looking at their cumulative economic impact. To the extent people oppose looking at cumulative economic impact, I would suspect they believe the number will be quite high. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel, and I thank all of you for your opening statements. First question I would just ask all of you across the board, and you can give me a yes or no, recognizing that EPA does a very thorough job in its analysis looking at health care benefits. I would ask you, each one of you, do you think it would be beneficial to have an analysis made by some independent agency of the cumulative economic impact of regulations coming out of EPA that are identified in this legislation? Mr. Cawley.
Chairman Whitfield, I do believe the electric power industry would benefit from comprehensive review. One of the challenges of maintaining a long-term reliable bulk power supply is having some amount of certainty to commit resources. It takes sometimes 4, 6, 8 years to site and build generation.
Would you believe it would be of benefit then?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Schaefer.
I can't object to the concept. Intuitively it makes sense. The question is whether it will delay issue of rules that have been overdue for so many years, and whether the cumulative benefits will also be considered.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Yes, I do, sir.
Mr. Hess?
Yes, sir, I do.
Dr. Ridgway?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Steinzer?
No, sir.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes, and I just wanted to say one thing about whether or not it can be done or whether it be too hard to do. I've talked to former EPA air administrators and former general counsels of the agency who assure me this type of work is available to them, could be done, and we could proceed and do this work, but we don't do it.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Bailey, we've heard some comments today, which is understandable, that anytime industry hears about a regulation, they're going to be impacted about it, they immediately start complaining about the cost of this new regulation and the jobs that will be lost, and paint a very sad scenario. You're out there every day dealing with this issue. It's your responsibility to run this electricity company, producing electricity. Why, with the unprecedented activity of this EPA, one regulation right after the other, why is it so difficult for you as a CEO responsible to comply with these kinds of regulations? Why is it so difficult?
Well, clearly, we want to keep the rates low for all our customers. We're not profits, so we're not trying to make profits on increasing our rates. But we are rate regulated in Kentucky. Cooperatives are. We're regulated by the Public Service Commission, and rates are not adjusted until after you make the investment. And if you make investments based on what you know at one point in time, and it's later found as different rules come out that was an imprudent decision, it's impossible to recover all that investment, if any of it. So clearly that would be money that was not well spent from that standpoint.
So one of your big concerns is you invest money and then you realize that the regulation has been changed again, or it is changed again, and then you invest again. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it'd be very difficult to go to a board of directors and say, we need to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, and say, we're not quite sure whether this will solve the requirement or not.
And do you view the air transport rule more of an obstacle for you than, say, the Utility Act, or how do you look at those two?
Well, the transport rule, as it appears now, and of course the rules aren't finally promulgated, but it appears that will be required to comply beginning in 2012 and 2014. The time does just not permit us to make the capital addition. So basically, we'll have to reduce generation.
And how serious is your concern that your biggest customer, those aluminum smelters, they are your biggest customer?
Yes, sir, they are.
How concerned are you that because of the increase in price of electricity that they may actually close up and leave?
I'm very concerned. As you look at statistics over the years, I think there were 34 smelters in this country in 1978. Now we're down to about 9. And our customers are telling us all the time they're worried about rate increases. So if you look at the magnitudes of 40%, you look at the world prices that smelters pay, ours are in the top 20% right now.
You know, one of the things that concerns me is that I think this administration is overselling green energy. And I say that because green energy may be available in the long out future, but for right now, when we expect our energy demands to increase by 40%, Mr. Siegel said that 1/2 of coal fuel fleet availability may not be there. How in the world can we meet our electricity demands? Windmills, solar panels, hydropower are simply not going to be able to do it. My time's expired. Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The whole premise behind today's hearing on the Train Act is that there is a train wreck of EPA regulations coming down the pike that will cripple different industries. And Ms. Steinzoy, you kind of characterize this as being the great-grandmother of all federally unfunded mandates. I thought that was pretty creative. And then I heard Mr. Siegel say that for every one green job created, there are nine current industrial jobs will be lost. I think I heard him say that. What do you think about his conclusion that for every one green job that's created, there will be 9 current industrial jobs eliminated?
I have no knowledge of what study he's talking about, and perhaps he could enlighten us. I will say that we have done a very close examination of a study known as Crane and Crane, which is cited a lot by the Small Business Administration, and claims that there will be about $3 trillion regulations will cost. And among other things, that study includes the time people spend filling out their tax returns. It is based on a opinion poll in countries that rated whether they were a favorable environment from a regulatory perspective. It was never intended to be used as a foundation for mathematical characterization like that. So I would say that every time we have looked at a study that gives numbers with that kind of pinpointed precision, when you look a little bit beneath the assumptions that go into those numbers, you find that they're dramatically overstated. And happy to look at the study that Mr. Siegel was referring to.
Yeah. Will there be any financial costs, in your opinion, associated with implementing this act and creating yet another committee to study these rules that EPA has already studied and mandated by the law? And maybe you can answer this: what is the cost financially, and is it paid for as mandated by the new rules of the House?
I actually think that it would not satisfied. There has been no analysis of what the unfunded mandate would be on state governments, but also private sector, everybody sitting at this table. One of the things the legislation does is to require this committee to analyze what a potential permitting action, how that would affect the electricity prices. And to analyze that, you need to know everybody who's thinking of a project and might get a permit out to 2030. And the only way to do that is to ask them. So I would expect everyone at this table to be receiving an except for me, of course, and Mr. Schaefer, to be receiving an information request for this committee. And if they don't, then the number's going to be a stab in the dark, which is really the problem with it. Very expensive, and yet won't be accurate.
Mr. Schaefer, are there any costs to business associated with delaying industry-wide rules and regulations and pushing regulatory reform further down the road for some future date? Is there any cost to businesses that you can think of? Yeah.
My apologies.
Well, I ask you again, Mr. Schaefer. All right. Are there any costs to business associated with delaying industry-wide rules and pushing regulatory reform further down the line, further down the road for some future date?
Congressman Rush, I think that generally is. I think that the delay of game is a major tactic in Washington. If you can push the rules off to the future, you save money, and that's fair enough if that's what people want to do. I tried to make the point earlier in my testimony. These regulations had statutory deadlines, were supposed to have been met many years ago. They were not. They will now be met more or less around 2015 instead of a decade or more earlier, in some cases 20 to 30 years earlier. In all that time, the industry's been able to save money that they otherwise would have had to spend meeting the deadlines that Congress set out for these regulations.
You may.
The gentleman from Oklahoma, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Siegel, could you comment on the statements of Ms. Steinzor, please?
Sure. Well, with respect to green jobs, the study that I quoted actually deals with experience in Europe, specifically in Spain, found that for every 4 so-called green jobs that were created, 9 industrial jobs were lost. And I will tell you, it comes from a country that was very skeptical about that conclusion. In fact, Spain, Italy, a number of countries in Western Europe are very, very proactive when it comes to encouraging investment in green jobs. Imagine how disappointed they were to learn that the so-called green jobs tends to pay substantially less in dollars, or has less in salary, is more temporary in duration, i.e., operating a coal plant versus constructing a wind farm, and has a whole lot less as far as actual numbers of jobs are concerned. Since that study came out, it's been supplemented with data, not just from the Spain study, but also from Denmark and from Scotland and from Germany, again, countries that really were dedicated to promotion of green jobs. So we've got a situation where this is somewhat illusory. Bottom line for the train wreck, if you will, or the overlapping regulations in the power sector, there's only one study to date, and I include the Environmental Protection Agency, that has actually netted out offsetting near-term construction jobs from putting on a new whiz-bang at a power plant versus actual loss from bringing capacity offline. That's the study that this committee has heard today, performed by ICF International, released in January of 2011, using the same contractor and the same modeling, a proprietary model that the Environmental Protection Agency uses, but using more realistic assumptions about the actual technology that will be required to implement these rules. One study, and it shows a deficit of 2.5 million jobs if we have the simultaneity of adoption that is proposed and warmly welcomed by the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cawley, what could people expect to happen when the reliability of electricity supply is low?
In the worst case, Congressman Sullivan, when we have a shortage of supply, we end up with rolling blackouts and those sorts of things. Usually the industry is planning ahead to make sure that there's an adequate supply, but things like extreme weather and conditions can create shortages.
In your opinion, is it possible to perform a robust forecast of electricity reliability without doing some kind of cumulative analysis of the potential impacts of regulations?
I think a cumulative analysis is essential, and that's why we as an independent organization have taken that responsibility on and produced our report last October, and will continue doing assessments in the future.
Also, given the responsibility that has been given to the NERC to ensure the reliability of the bulk power system in North America, would NERC consider it sufficient to look at the impact of regulations one by one instead of in a cumulative analysis? If not, why not?
The challenge is that the real decisions for investing in new plants and new facilities is a long-term investment decision. Requires siting, requires significant investment resources, and it's not a year-by-year, month-by-month decision process. So to make effective decisions that are good for customers, a comprehensive look is essential.
Also, of the major EPA rules, NERC analyzed in its assessment, which regulations have the greatest potential reliability implications?
The greatest impact was the cooling water regulation, according to our report completed last October.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I yield back. Oh, you have some more time? Okay. I would like to say that in Region 6, the EPA, just to show you how these regulations cost people, cost states, is we did a state implementation plan required to do that to achieve a goal the EPA wanted us to achieve, and they came back and did a federal implementation plan, which would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, which would just get passed on to the consumer. I just think that does have an impact on our economy, does have an impact on jobs, and it certainly that none of that was done before they didn't analyze anything before they did that. And I think that you're seeing this hurting the economy, hurting the jobs. You see these EPA rules. I heard there's more coming down the pike that are hundreds of millions of dollars each, and I think that having an analysis of it is not something that's bad. Thank you.
Mr. Green, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. And while I'm sympathetic to the argument we face in the regulatory landscape we do because of several delays in rulemaking over the last couple of decades, that doesn't mean we can ignore the fact that companies are faced with complying several rules all at the same time. As such, I do think it's appropriate to study the cumulative impact of multiple regulations on competitiveness and sustainability of businesses and other regulated entities and the related impacts on jobs. Concerning the discussion draft before us, though, I think there are some drafting issues that need to be addressed, and I also think we should look at or at least acknowledge the public health effects of such rules in order to be fair. And hopefully I could get to be a yes on the bill, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to look at drafting. I'm glad this is a draft, and I'd like to work with you on it. And I think I share that with our ranking member, Congressman Rush. Now for my questions. Are any of you able to comment on how the EPA is complying with President Obama's July the 18th executive order stating agencies must consider costs and how best to reduce the burdens of American business and consumers? Do we know what the status is? Scott?
Well, I'll tell you this much. The agency has asked for folks to file comments, and so there's an open process there, which is good, and people will file comments on it. That said, you know, the executive order is released in January, and we have a raft of rulemaking proposals that come out, particularly in March. And it seems as though these rulemakings, the golden opportunity to comply with the executive order would have been to acknowledge the cumulative impact, or at least, how about this, to acknowledge the executive order in these new proposals that came out. And of course, none of them, they just barreled on down the path full steam ahead. So I don't think they've taken it to heart, the spirit of the executive order, which is what makes the Train Act so interesting, because it actually gives teeth to the executive order. But, you know, assuming it's drafted appropriately.
Mr. Schaefer, I understand you argue that the industry should not complain because these rules should have been implemented years ago. And how do you respond to the fact that these rules now are all coming down the pike at once? Take Mr. Bailey's statement. for example, that the expense of installing control equipment on coal-fired generating units to comply with two of the rules may be wasted effort if it's later found that conversion to natural gas is the best solution to meet the later issued deadline. How do you respond? Of course, coming from Texas, I think everything ought to be natural gas, but how do you respond to it?
Congressman Green, that's a good question. I'm confused by what I've heard in the discussion, because on the one hand I hear it's all coming together, it's too much, and on the other hand I hear, well, we kind of need it all to come together so we can plan and be rational about it. And in fact, we've heard the industry testify to that effect for years. They'd like to have it, all, see it all at once. So I'm not sure if that's an answer. I will quickly say that some companies have already done the work needed to comply with these rules, and if they are put off, we're not going to have a level playing field. In my state of Maryland, we have big coal plants. Coal supplies more than half the electricity. Mercury down by nearly 90%. Sulfur dioxide virtually eliminated at the Brandon Shores facility. Bag houses put on, millions of hours of work created for people. Those plants are ready. They anticipated these rules. They didn't bank on being able to delay compliance. And then, on the other hand, we have some plants that have done very little. And for those, yes, they are going to have some costs. But I don't want to leave the impression that we've got all the coal plants in the same situation, because they're in very different places.
Okay. I'm almost out of time. I have a question for Mr. Cawley, but Mr. Siegel, thank you for testifying, and just that we've worked together on a lot of years on energy, and I appreciate I'd like to ask you, though, about timing of the implementation of the utility MAC rule. Mm-hmm. I've heard that 3 years is just not feasible for compliance, and Ms. McCauley feels free to respond also. How much time would these facilities need to comply with this rule, assuming there is no delay of the rule or changes made to it?
There are two elements that we need to keep in mind. One is timing, and 3 years, to begin the process in 2015, it's not even really 3 years when you consider the planning process. A minimum of 5 years is needed in order to really plan it out, and that is pushing it. But there's also substantive issues, because it's not just a timing question. It's a question of how you establish the MAC floor. It's a question of whether there's adequate what's called subcategorization within the rule that will make the difference between whether this rule is workable or not, even if given a significant amount of time. So there's a time issue and a substance issue. I
know I'm out of time, but Mr. Chairman, could Mr. Cawley respond? Is there anything different than from what
I would just defer to Mr. Siegel as representing the owners and operators.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Shimkus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming. If they put up the Edison Electric analysis of the train wreck real quick, I said that in my opening statement. Does anyone agree that, does there anyone disagree that these regs are coming down in this timeline? No. So everyone agrees that these 8 regulations are coming down between 08 and 16. Good. You disagree?
I don't have it in front of me, and I can't see it here.
All right. Well, I'll give this to you, and then you can confer.
Okay, I appreciate that.
But I think the answer is no one disagrees that this is the train wreck. This is what we are referring to: ozone, SOx, NOx, transport, water, particulate matter, ash, mercury, carbon dioxide. Now, we tried to address carbon dioxide today on the floor, passed to deny EPA the ability to regulate greenhouse gases. We're going to continue to do that. We'll probably work on some of these other ones, like the water, especially particulate matter. I mean, these are ludicrous. They're as crazy as the carbon dioxide regulation. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, we move on some of these easier ones to address like we did on the floor today. The question was asked, has the EPA complied with the presidential executive order? Mr. Siegel is the only one who responded. The order came out in January. Regulations came out in March. I would submit no. No one else responded to that question by Mr. Green. So, yeah, quickly.
Can I just ask, if you're concerned about the schedule, wouldn't it be more straightforward to try and amend the Clean Air Act?
Well, I think through the court rulings that the court rulings already said, which we disagree with, that the Clean Air Act was designed for criteria pollutants. We disagree with the court ruling that CO2, which is a non-toxic emittant, is a criteria pollutant. Let me move on. I don't have enough time to debate you. You're always welcome to come visit with me in the office. Mr. Bailey, tell me about this big slush fund that you've developed in your co-op over the last 10 years or 30 years because you haven't complied with some futuristic view of rules that are coming down. Do you have one?
Well, as I said, we're nonprofit.
So you don't have a slush fund? You haven't built up all this capital money?
Well, actually, our net book value right now is around $980 million.
So to comply with $1 million of capital development and equipment, what are you going to have to do?
Well, we're going to have to first get some clarity to know exactly what the requirements are. And then once you have that, you've got the time, you've got to construct that.
And the problem with the train wreck is there's no clarity.
That's right. I might point out, though, that of that $980 million net value, $360 million of it's for environmental equipment.
Thank you. Dr. Ridgway, I wish I had more time to ask you more questions. I also have Purdue Boilermaker, Big Ten, all that good stuff. But Southern Illinois University at Carbondale has a power plant. Yes, so what are you all going to do to pay for the capital expense to meet the train wreck?
The current mode that we have to do is request funds from the state for capital improvements.
And that's readily available in this environment, right?
Not so much.
Tuition, tax increases, is really going to affect the bottom line of universities.
Absolutely.
That operate this.
Absolutely, and I think our campuses are expanding, and these facilities are designed to supply heating and cooling and electricity to all the campus buildings.
Thank you. I'm going to cut you off because I want to get to this. Mr. Schaefer, you, Ms. Claudia Rogers testified in Small Business Administration yesterday on the House Committee on Oversight, and she says EPA now has a complete, it's right here, EPA now has a completed regulatory process which has or will soon subject small businesses to the burden of Clean Air Act permitting, a burden that the tailoring rule has failed to address for some and is only delayed by a few years. Throughout the rulemaking process, our office has informed EPA that it should adequately consider the impacts of this program on small business. I'd like to submit this for the record. You've testified that the administration has exhaustively reviewed this. Did you not?
Yes, I did.
Isn't the Small Business Administration part of the administration? My point is, I reject your premise.
Would you like an answer?
Well, no, I'm going to answer it because the Small Business Administration is part of the administration. They testified yesterday. This is disastrous. And I'll end up with Ms. Steinzor. You've been before us before. Just briefly, I'll just say, you say it's a crystal ball to be able to project cost, although you testify that the health benefits that go out to 2025 can be made. So which is it? Is economic cost projected out 25 years, crystal ball, or the health savings projected out to 2020, 2025? Can you project health benefits but not project economic cost? Which is the real crystal ball?
The health benefits have to do with rules that have already been promulgated. Your legislation deals with rules.
You say we can't project economic cost 20 to 25 years out?
When you have a final rule, you can, but your legislation covers.
You can't have it both ways. You can project out to 2025.
Mr. Matheson, he's author of the legislation with Mr. Sullivan. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time and appreciate the witnesses coming here today. I think the goal behind this legislation, and we're here to have a hearing to figure out if there are ways to perfect it and make it better, but the goal is you look at the situation where EPA right now has the ability to look at costs and benefits of rules individually, and that's important. But the goal here is maybe we ought to take a look at how these things work when you put them all together. And we want to harmonize that process. And I think that really is the goal. The goal is not necessarily to delay things. The goal is to have some credible information where instead of everyone working in their own little stovepipe, we're all working together and looking at the cumulative impact. And if there are suggestions among the witnesses, any of them, about how to refine this legislation to meet those goals better than the way it's written now, as one of the authors of the legislation, like Mr. Sullivan, we're open to that. And so beyond the testimony today, if people want to submit other ideas to us, I ask you to do that, because that is where we're really coming from. We're not talking about focusing only on costs. Mr. Schaefer, I noticed in your testimony you indicated you felt concerned that the study really will only focus on costs, but there's nothing in the legislation that mentions specifically costs or benefits. The legislation talks about effects and impacts across a variety of sectors, and I think that's what we're looking for. So I don't think our intent was to not include other considerations when we talk about effects and impacts. Here's a question, quick statement. I want to make a couple of questions. First of all, Mr. Cawley, as you know, NERC is one of the participants that's included in the study. And you've already studied aggregate effects of 4 of EPA's pending rules: cooling water intake structures, utility maximum available control technology, clean air transport rule, and coal combustion residuals. Can you elaborate on the recommendations NERC provided to manage the implications of implicating those 4 rules to ensure power supply is not disrupted?
Our study looked at plans that were in place with existing resources and planned resources, and our assessment determined that as much in a worst case of 78 gigawatts of generation would be impacted, would become no longer cost effective to operate. So our concern as a reliability organization is ensuring that if those rules were put in place, that we would have sufficient time and planning to have alternative resources put in place. And that's our job, is to look out to the future and see if there's something bad going to happen for reliability.
Do you think it's possible to expand that study for all of the rules that are listed in the draft legislation?
I think it's, as long as there's good definition around the expected rules and obligations, I think that kind of study can be done.
Okay. Mr. Bailey, you mentioned in your testimony, like a lot of electric utilities around the country and in my district, that because the rules from the EPA have not been coordinated, you're facing a lot of uncertainty over how to plan for upgrades and comply with various different deadlines. How do you think this act will help Big Rivers with investment decisions and planning for your facilities as you go forward?
Well, certainly if there's a coordinated effort, it could lead to answers at least at the same time, and then presumably there'll be a reasonable time to implement. Mm-hmm. And certainly you've got certainty at that point and feel much more comfortable proceeding. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, at this point, that's all the questions I have. I just want to reiterate, if people have suggestions to meet the goals I talked about, we're open. This is why we have hearings on draft legislation, look for ideas, and we welcome suggestions for text. Thanks so much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. Mr. McKinley, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a series of observations, as I say. One was, and I'm sorry that the Congressman from California is not here right now, because he made the statement earlier. He said that we should, his quote, we should consider the cost when we're evaluating the benefits. But yet, we've had come before our committee, members of the EPA said that's not their responsibility. I'm not sure that there's a contradiction there. If we should, then why aren't we doing it? And I think that the Dr. Ridgely has really hit on this, this whole subject of uncertainty. As engineers, we deal in certainty. And there was an issue I think Mr. Schaefer talked about. We should follow the studies. The train wreck was a known entity. We know when it was going to happen. We could see it on a chart. But yet, here are 2 reports that show the uncertainty with this. Is that, and I'd like to enter these in the record if I consent to admit these. These are reports that were done in '93 and 2000 that said, for example, fly ash is not a hazardous material, but yet the EPA is going to impose that. That's the uncertainty we're talking about. You can have a schedule, but when you're dealing in the real world, where the EPA rejects its own studies and does this, I just find that unconscionable. There's no wonder that Purdue and other universities and other coal-fired generating houses are scared to death of what's going to happen as it relates to the fly ash. It's this. I'm just curious if I could ask a question of you, Dr. Ridgely. How much money is that going to cost Purdue by not being able to implement their project?
The boiler project or for the coal ash?
It's coal ash.
From the coal ash standpoint, and we generate coal ash right now, but our
Yes.
current cost for handling that material right now is about $300,000 a year. If EPA goes and classifies that material as hazardous waste, it increases our cost to $25 million a year to dispose of that material.
Think about it. But yet, that's the frustrating part here, is to sit here as a new member and hear these people come up and say that we're not supposed to consider the cost. Where is that $25 million going to come from? Is it student fees? Is it going to be increased taxes? I'm just amazed at the insensitivity to people about these cost issues of what they would be. But go to the boiler issue. How much more is the boiler, by not being able to, you were going to put a new boiler in, new high efficiency unit in?
Yes, we were going to add capacity to our existing combined heat and power facility. It was a clean coal technology boiler, and because of regulatory uncertainty, we have not moved ahead with that project. So we still have to provide steam to campus, and we still have to provide chilled water, and we'll be purchasing more electricity because we'll be unable to generate that power in-house, which is what we historically had been able to do. And I don't have the specific numbers, but I can certainly get that to you later.
Thank you. I think you've gone right to the core of this train wreck, the uncertainty that's swirling around. We're seeing companies who use fly ash, in concrete as an additive. They use fly ash in drywall manufacture, and they're scared right now. They don't know what to do. Everyone's frozen in place because of the uncertainty of this regulatory activism from the EPA. Companies are afraid to do anything with it. So what we're going to wind up doing is we're either going to lose jobs, we're going to spend a lot more money, and we're just going to cause people concern. And I don't think that's our mission here in Washington to do that. One of the major powerhouse that was going to burn coal in Ohio has switched over to gas because of the uncertainty that you've dealt with at Purdue. That means thousands of jobs have been lost in the coal industry of West Virginia and all through Appalachia because of the uncertainty of the EPA. I've got a chemical plant in my district that's seriously considering. They're taking designs right now to switch from coal over to gas. That's going to cost West Virginia and Appalachia thousands of jobs over a period of years. I can't thank you enough for coming here, Ms. Ridgely, to be able to talk about this issue. But you've given an exact example of why we should be more concerned about reining in this rogue agency. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley, and Ms. Capps, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to express my thanks to each one of our witnesses for their presence here today and your testimony. Mr. Schaefer, we've heard a lot of concern today about the notion that EPA has decided to impose multiple regulations in the upcoming years. But as you point out, these regulations are long overdue, and industry has had years to plan to meet. And there's no surprises here that there's been a lot of time to plan to meet these requirements. Would you discuss the impacts of this delay on industry and on the public? I know you brought it up in your testimony, but just so that we get this clear in the record.
Congresswoman Capps, I think, as I was trying to explain earlier, that we do have some power companies that have gotten ahead of the curve, and yes, in some cases have made the decision to switch to gas. In a market economy, we're going to see those decisions. And some of that's driven by regulation. A lot of it's driven by the fact that gas is a cheaper fuel now. And I thought I'd read that Purdue had switched a boiler to gas that they were planning to build for that reason. In the state of Maryland, we've got very strict requirements. Hasn't seemed to affect the use of coal in the state. We still have big coal plants. It's just that they're well scrubbed and well controlled. So if you have a company that's banked on delay and waited till the last minute, hasn't looked at the deadlines, hasn't followed the litigation, hasn't anticipated these rules, yes, they're going to face some significant costs, but you have others that have gotten far ahead of it. The point I was also trying to make earlier is if you've not spent much to comply with requirements that are coming, if you haven't scrubbed your plant, for example, and you've got a 60-year-old coal plant designed to last 30 years, you're going to have to pay for some pollution controls. And to be shocked that that's arriving now, I think is, I don't understand that. I don't see how anybody could not see that coming.
Thank you. Given the importance of these regulations to public health, I would hope that any desire to understand the cumulative impacts of regulations would not in themselves become obstacles to their implementation. A cumulative estimate of regulatory impact can only have value if it is credible. I'm concerned that the report envisioned by this bill will be rife with uncertainties and will be attacked by all the stakeholders. As one example, which has come up before, coal ash. The committee would be asked to analyze the impact of coal ash regulation along with other rules, even if that regulation is not finalized. We've heard conflicting testimony today about the potential impacts of regulating coal combustion waste because there are still a number of unknowns with regard to the rule. It is not known whether regulation will occur under subtitle C or D, is one example. It's not known whether regulation under subtitle D, which would create no federally enforceable requirements, would have a significant impact. And it is not known whether regulation under subtitle C would impact beneficial reuse because of stigma effects. So in order to perform the analysis required by this bill, the committee would need to fill in those unknowns with assumptions. No choice that will be supported by all stakeholders. And we could illustrate that right here today. I could ask three of you a question, which I will now to demonstrate. Dr. Ridgway, if the committee assumed subtitle C regulation and little impact on beneficial reuse, would you view the resulting analysis as credible?
I'm not sure I can speak to that because I don't know what information goes into that analysis.
That's exactly the point. So really, to be honest, then you'd have to say, no, I couldn't because just for all the reasons you said. Ms. Steinzer, on the other hand, the committee assumed subtitle C regulation and a halt to beneficial use. Would you have the resulting analysis as credible?
No.
And Mr. Schaefer, if the committee assumed subtitle D regulation and nationwide compliance with the resulting guidelines, would you review the resulting analysis as credible? Well, there you have it. That shows where we are. Our panel of 7 stakeholders can't agree on the impact of one rule, let alone the cumulative impact of the rule and Clean Air Act regulation. I cannot imagine how a committee of cabinet secretaries and Mr. Cawley is going to produce a credible estimate of the impacts of these listed rules, let alone the additional rules that aren't listed. And that would be with all the time in the world, not within the 1 month that they appear to have under this bill. And I've used as much time as I have, but I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Olson, you're recognized 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. And before I get started, I would like to identify myself with the comments from my colleague from Texas, Mr. Green, who said that we like gas in Texas. We like it a lot. Welcome to the witnesses. I'm grateful for your expertise and your patience today. My dad spent his entire career in the paper industry, over 35 years, mostly in the white mills across our country. I know firsthand knowledge that the industry is committed to clean air and clean water. So my first question is for you, Mr. Hess. The proposed cooling water intake rule, 316B, subjects facilities beyond electric generation facilities to regulation, including paper manufacturing and oil refining. Will these facilities be able to comply with the criteria in the proposed rule, and what are the economic impacts? Or put another way, is the technology there, and what's it going to cost?
I can't speak to the details of that regulation, but I can, because I have a staff, just as you have a staff that advises me on environmental regulations. But I can tell you it's going to cost a lot, because the environmental regulations that we have implemented at Spring Grove to address the EPA MACT and other rules have cost $50 million at the end of the 1990s, and we're looking at $10 to $20 million for boiler MACT currently, and if the original MACT program is revised, we're looking at another $10 to $20 million. I don't have the specifics on the regulation you referenced, but I'm just giving you a taste of the impact that we've had at the Spring Grove Mill.
Thank you, sir. So I assume that's a pretty negative impact on our ability to compete in the global market.
Yes, sir. That's the major concern that I have, is that we do compete in a global marketplace, and that all these costs, the cumulative cost, have to get passed through the supply chain, which makes us less competitive in the marketplace, makes imports in other countries have lower cost products, and at the end of the day, he who has the best product at the lowest cost wins. We can compete in a global marketplace if we're playing on a fair playing field, but today we're not, because no other country plans to regulate as the train wreck is coming.
Yes, sir, and that's something we're here to stop. Mr. Siegel, my next question is for you, sir. In your opinion, do you think EPA has been proactive during the rulemaking process in explaining to stakeholders and the public the reasons for certain regulations and the potential job and economic impacts of those regulations?
Well, the best thing to point to answer that question, Mr. Olson, is to look at the regulatory impact analysis that the EPA released when it advanced its rule. And it's a very, very curious document. I don't commend it to you. It's north of 500 pages, and it will cure any insomnia. But the good part about it is it really lays bare a lot of what's going on here. One of the critical assumptions the agency made, and that explains why they say the cost of that rule is much less than everybody else who's taken a look at this rule, is they make an assumption about certain technologies that could be used so that you wouldn't have to install scrubbers necessarily. So we thought this is very curious, because my clients actually make power. We know a thing or two about that technology, so we thought we'd take a look. And we follow, like with so many things, you have to follow the footnotes. And when you do, you find, well, there is no study on the technology they cited. There's a 5-page PowerPoint presentation that says as one of its recommendations, hey, we did a two-week study here. We ought to see if it's scalable and could actually be used on a power plant. And the EPA accepted that with 100% confidence in order to lower their cost assessment of the rule. If we had done that in a rulemaking comment, or worse yet, in one of our corporate reports on our earnings, can you imagine the hue and cry that would have been raised? But apparently for EPA, when it cuts in their favor, making untransparent assumptions is a great way to reduce costs in your regulatory impact analysis. And that's just one example. We could have many other examples that would illustrate the point. I do want to make one other point, though, sir. We've heard over and over again, these companies have known for 20 or 30 years what the rules would be. They've been living high on the hog by simply not complying for the intervening 20 years. The trouble is there's a fundamental disagreement between Professor Steinzer and Mr. Schaefer. See, Mr. Schaefer says that 20 years in advance, you ought to know what all the details of the rule are just by looking at what the statutory obligation is. Ms. Steinzer says you can't possibly do an assessment, an economic assessment of a rule until you have a final rule, which, by the way, strikes me as reasonable. And it therefore strikes me that Mr. Schaefer is perhaps not so reasonable in suggesting that people have known for 20 years what their obligation was. I think he knows that, and I know that. I think all of you should know it too.
Yes, sir, thank you. And that's why I've introduced a bill to make sure that EPA puts a study in the numbers of job gains or losses from any regulation. And again, curious, that's not a word we want to use in a regulatory environment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. Inslee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel. You represent something called the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council. How many companies are members of that coalition?
I think 8.
Approximately. And could you tell them, give us their names, please?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. You don't have to do it right now, but if
okay.
you just give it to us on record, I'd appreciate
because I always
that.
Leave somebody out. And that makes
Thank you. Mr. Schaefer, my understanding of this proposed legislation would basically assess some of the costs associated with some regulatory compliance, particularly for environmental and things adopted to try to improve the environment and therefore improve the health of Americans. My understanding of the legislation is it does not attempt to assess the value to health of Americans that would be associated with those compliance with those rules, nor does it assess the improvement in economic performance associated with that corresponding health improvements of Americans, nor does it represent the economic growth associated with a lot of the technologies associated with compliance with these rules. I have to tell you, I just can't understand why we would, on any of these issues, look at just costs and not benefits, unless you would assume there's never a benefit of anything the government's ever done in human history. So I guess the question is my assessment of the legislation correct in that regard? And can you fathom any reason why we wouldn't want to look at benefits as well as costs?
I haven't, Congressman, and I heard earlier that balance was the goal. I have a copy of the draft, and now I'm concerned that I may not have the right copy because I'm looking at the list of the things that the agencies would be required to study. I see no mention of health. I see no mention of the economic issues you just mentioned on the other side of the ledger. And it's possible I have the wrong copy or an earlier draft. And
So let me ask the panel.
I think you have the right draft.
well, I have the list in front of me, and I heard Congressman Matheson suggest that health was in here, and I don't see it.
So let me ask the panel, do any of the panels, I'm trying to figure out why we would ever embrace this idea of looking at just costs and not benefits of proposals. That just doesn't make sense to me unless you hold certain perceptions. So let me ask you this. Do any of the panel members believe that there's never been a benefit to human health that came from EPA regulations? Do any members believe that on the panel? Okay, so we're all on board that at least in some instances EPA helps Americans' health. So that's not a reason for not looking at the benefits. I would be open to any of you suggesting why, if we are trying to make intelligent decisions about hard regulatory decisions here, can anyone advance a reason to ignore an evaluation by the U.S. government of the benefits associated with any of these regulatory activities? Can anybody suggest a reason why we would only look at the costs? I'm searching for, Mr. Siegel's raised his hand there.
Well, you're not going to like me for suggesting this, but I will say this.
I haven't formed an opinion at this point.
That's right.
So.
And that's why I fear that we'll be moving in that direction. But I'm going to suggest that it's hard to accumulate benefits of environmental rules. And let me explain why. Do you know, since I've come to Washington, almost every clean air rule claims particulate matter benefits as a reason to adopt that rule. Now, I have come to the conclusion, sir, that some of these benefits are the same benefits that are being claimed for multiple rule after multiple rule, even though the costs, because they're requiring new pieces of technology, are not the same cost. So I'd be okay with doing a cumulative analysis of benefits if we back out, and I will cover this in my statement, if we back out double counting of benefits that goes on when rule after rule after rule uses the same homework. EPA's own analysis on Utility MACT said we didn't do any effort to estimate the benefits of actually reducing hazardous air pollutants. All we did was plug in the old PM numbers that we used last time around.
So
that's bad homework.
I think I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have an objection then if this committee amended this bill to say, let's look at the health benefits and subsequent economic benefits of some of these rules and be cautious not to allow double benefits to be counted. But the general idea
I'd like to work on something like that and really focus in on that double.
Well, let me just ask you, don't you agree we ought to look at the benefits of these rules in this legislation as well as the cost, Mr. Siegel? Would you agree that, and as a general principle, we ought to do that?
I was curious about Mr. Matheson's statement too, and I looked at the deal, and it says that you're supposed to look at cumulative impact, and then it says impact is supposed to include, and it lists all these economic factors. But, I mean, I guess cumulative impact could include other things too. It's not exclusive of that list, so maybe that's what Mr. Matheson what he meant. I don't know. I haven't talked to Mr. Matheson about it.
Thank you.
Ms. Singer's shaking her head though. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Inslee. At this time, Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Siegel, going back to this report, I was very interested in your comments in regard to how the EPA lowered their cost by using a slide
deck.
A slide deck that they then extrapolated from in order to lower the cost of theirs. Am I not correct that if this was a corporation doing that the people who knew that they were lowering that to make it look like there was less cost would suffer criminal penalties?
I tell you, if it were a corporation and we based representations in our quarterly filings on something like that, we'd be in a world of trouble. If it were a law firm basing legal analysis on that, we'd be in a world of trouble. But the EPA felt pretty comfortable with it.
But world of trouble includes criminal penalties, does it not?
Actually, it's not my field of practice, but I wouldn't call you a liar.
All right, thank you. And I'm not sure on each case, but it was my area of practice.
All right.
And let me shift gears. Mr. Hess, thank you very much for being here. Some of the folks on this committee who are getting to know me think that all we do in Southwest Virginia is coal because I talk about it all the time.
Yes, sir.
But we also have textiles and cellulose production and paper production. And most of the pressure on our industry in our area, and I want to know if this is true nationally, is from Scandinavia and South America. Would that be true nationally, or is that just my particular?
That's part of the pressure. There's also pressure from Asia. I mean, from China as well.
All right. And the little plant in my district that employs most of the folks in the or a lot of the folks in the Allegheny Highlands indicated that they had a chart similar to the one that we've got here from Edison with all the different things coming at them in the next few years. And if they get to a certain point, they're just not going to be able to survive the market pressures, and that they would probably have to move to properties in another country. Is that true nationally? You're finding that to be the same situation, that most of these companies, if all of these hit them at one time, they're just going to have no choice but to go somewhere else?
I can guarantee you that as part of the options analysis that companies are going through, they're looking at whether they can maintain their operation within the United States. And because of the confusion that's associated with the rules and the uncertainty and the magnitude of change that's coming at the pace it's coming, it's impossible to plan appropriately in the business. And I can tell you right now, we're looking at possibility of boiler shutdown as well because of these type of rules.
And not every plant can switch over to natural gas, can they?
No, not every plant can switch over to natural gas. And clearly the Boiler Act rules are pushing plants towards natural gas. We're doing a natural gas study, but not every plant has the infrastructure to burn natural gas. In addition, you know, part of what makes a paper company successful is being able to burn biomass residuals. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole sister act with regard to biomass residuals being classified as solid waste.
Let me underline that I also have a few of our furniture manufacturers have survived, and they do the same thing. They burn off the leftover biomass, the wood pieces that they don't use.
And that is, I mean, that is what the president himself has encouraged business to do. It's a renewable resource, biomass. And we, with the regulations coming down with the sister regs about the biomass being classified as solid waste, it will trigger incinerator MAC for some of these plants and encourage them not to burn biomass, but instead convert to fossil fuel, which is exactly opposite of what the administration is pursuing.
Let me switch to you, Dr. Ridgway. We have some public universities that are in the same plight that Purdue is in, but I'm wondering if you can tell me, because I think it's true that there are a lot of independent, non-public universities and colleges, maybe not as big as Purdue, but who are in a similar plight, but they don't have anybody but the students to go to pay for this. Isn't that true? Because they don't have taxpayers that they can ask for increased money to pay for some of these things.
Yeah, I honestly can't speak to the funding mechanisms of other institutions. I
Okay.
just know our own process.
But it would be, but you said earlier that you would have to go and ask the state for more money. If you don't have the state and all you have are the parents and the students who are going to the school, it would make sense, would it not, that they would end up having to bear the cost through higher tuition?
It's possible, but I won't commit to that.
All right. And it's possible that if the state doesn't have the money, that the trustees of any public institution, including Purdue, might be forced to ask the students for a tuition increase. Isn't that true?
It's an avenue that's available.
And so in essence, one thing that could be the result of this is higher tuition and making it more difficult for middle class and lower income families to be able for their children to get an education and thus damage America's future. Isn't that also true?
You got to get the money from somewhere.
Mr. Griffith, thank you very much, and that will conclude today's hearing. We appreciate all of you taking time to be with us. We do intend to continue to look at this legislation. I anticipate that we will try to move this legislation and look forward to working with all the members of the committee to make it the most effective that we can. And once again, I apologize to you all for the delay that we had during the votes, but we look forward to working with you on this issue and others as we move forward. And the record will remain open for 10 business days for additional material to be inserted. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.